Good morning. Everyone's just arriving into the Zoom room.
Morning.
Let's just take one more minute. Let everyone arrive. Okay. Just a moment. This is Rated and Razed West Bank Education Under Attack. We will be starting in just a moment. Thank you for being here. Okay, just another quick moment. Just about to get started. Okay. Great. Okay. Thank you everyone for being here. Good morning. I'm very happy to welcome you to this Foundation for Middle East Peace webinar today entitled Rated and Razed West Bank Education Under Attack. A little background, and then I will introduce our panelists and we will launch in. Palestinians and human rights defenders have named 2020 as one of the most violent years for Palestinians in the West Bank in recent record. With de facto annexation, escalating assaults, evictions, and home demolitions. New research from the Norwegian Refugee Council looks at the impact of occupation on Palestinian education in the West Bank, detailing what they call a deluge of attacks perpetrated by Israeli forces, Israeli settlers, and settlement guards over the last 30 months. Palestinians in Area C are especially vulnerable to these attacks, which include raids on schools in session, physical assault of children, and damage of educational facilities. We're going to be discussing this research and these findings today and their impact, the impact of these assaults on Palestinian children, families, and educators, and potential routes to secure children's rights to education. The Foundation for Middle East Peace and the Norwegian Refugee Council are delighted to host this webinar today with Netta Amar-Shiff, Khaled Elgindy, and Priscilla Wathington. Thank you for being here. So quick background on our panelists, and then we'll really jump right in. Netta Amar-Shiff is a Yemeni Jewish Israeli human rights lawyer working on Palestinian rights since 1998. Her expertise is international human rights and humanitarian law, especially working on cases of planning, demolition, and forcible displacement in the West Bank, as well as constitutional and administrative law. And she is currently a doctoral candidate at the Geography and Environmental Department at Ben Gurion University in Beersheba. Khaled Elgindy is Senior Fellow and Director of the Program on Palestine and Palestinian-Israeli Affairs at the Middle East Institute and the author of the newly released book, not quite as newly anymore, still extremely worthwhile, Blind Spot, America and the Palestinians from Balfour to Trump. Khaled previously served as a fellow in the foreign policy program at the Brookings Institution and as an advisor to the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah on permanent status negotiations with Israel. And Priscilla Wathington is currently serving as Policy and Communications Specialist in the Norwegian Refugee Council's Palestine office and is author of the NRC's report, which we're discussing today. Previously, Priscilla was the managing editor at Defense for Children International Palestine. As is FMEP's regular practice, the format for today's webinar will be a discussion between the panelists and me. In addition, as moderator, in addition to my own questions, we are eager to take your questions, the audience questions, and you can submit them via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time during this panel. I will look at the Q&A box, but please do not put any questions into the chat as I will not be looking at the chat. We won't see those. Finally, if you have any technical problems with this webinar, please let us know using the chat, and my colleague, Kristen McCarthy, We'll make sure to solve your problems. Thank you. Let's begin. So Priscilla, I want to start with you. You authored the NRC report that was just released a few weeks ago about attacks on Palestinian education in the West Bank. Will you paint a picture for us of the school system servicing Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and then tell us what the main findings of the report were?
Yeah, certainly. So, responsibility for education in the West Bank is a bit of a mixed bag with these overlapping authorities. So you have, area A and B, where the Palestinian Authority is exerting full control over, delivering and managing the Palestinian education system. And then in area C, you have a more limited role that the Palestinian Authority is able to play, which I know others are going to expand on later. But what's really happening there is that you have this, overlap where the Palestinian Authority is doing a piece, but then the Israeli Authority is managing the security situation. And that's where, our report comes in, because things like movement, things like infrastructure, things like if a school needs to repair something or do an expansion, these are all coming in under, the framework of the Israeli security control. And so, that's where we start to see some of these protection issues and these problems. And then there's also UNRWA, to give kind of the wider landscape, and they're delivering education to children who are the refugees of Palestine and their descendants. And there's, of course, some smaller private education actors. And East Jerusalem, as you mentioned, represents this special case because of Israel's annexation of Jerusalem. We have about 80% of students there actually attending Israeli-controlled Jerusalem municipality schools there. So, there's a mix, but what is true is that wherever Palestinian students are going to school in the West Bank, Israel does have this duty to not commit attacks against education, to not impede, to not harm it. And our research, which covered the reporting period of January 2018 to June 2020, found that that's not what's happening. We found 235 incidents and 295 attacks in which Israeli forces, Israeli settlers, or private settlement security guards did harm education. And just, to explain what I mean by incidents was to kind of demonstrate, date and time, like continuity, and attack was to define particular types of violations, so that we were careful not to inflate our findings, because there could be one attack that sort of had mixed, there could be one incident, that had mixed perpetrators. And so it sort of snowballs and expands out, and multiple things happen during the same incident. So yeah, we used incidents and attacks to show that difference and sort of capture the incidents two ways.
Great,
So,
thank you.
So yeah, do I have more time?
You do, of course.
Okay, cool. So we found, quite wide-ranging behavior that was harming education. We're talking, military raids on schools. We're talking students being arrested, during the school day. We've seen cases of, settler attacks on the building while kids are present, or on school buses. It's quite wide-ranging phenomena. Even attempted kidnappings of children who are, traveling to and from school. But the big picture was that there were about, 10 on average a month, 10 incidents that were harming education per month, which is a pretty stunning pace when you think about it. And we drew this analysis from 5 different NGOs and from OSHA's publications, and looking at the Ministry of Education's data and cross-checking. So it was a pretty good baseline, certainly not comprehensive. I'm sure there were even more events that these organizations did not capture, but a pretty good data set there we had. So geographically, those people familiar with the West Bank won't be surprised to know that Hebron was the worst hit. They had 40% of all the instances where, Israeli forces or settlers harmed education. 40% took place just in this one governorate. but also Jerusalem and Nablus didn't do too well. And these areas had about 2 incidents on average every month. And, really important to point out that 3 out of 4 of the attacks were actually committed by Israeli forces themselves. So not just in abstaining from preventing the harm, but actually carrying out the harm. And we had 22 instances where Israeli forces actually physically assaulted, shot, or injured students with an object such as a crowd-controlled weapon. One incident that was a really significant one was this 9-year-old boy, Malik Isa, who was just getting off of the bus as he was returning home and was struck in the face with a sponge round. And he had to have his eye surgically removed. And that was, February 2020. So wide-ranging phenomenon, but certainly some are very, very severe.
Thank
so
you.
That gives you a sense, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that overview and that introduction to this research and to the situation. Thank you for setting us up. And Netta, I want to ask you also, please. So as a human rights lawyer who has worked so extensively with demolitions and planning and displacement, can you set the scene for us from a legal and an administrative perspective and explain to us the state of Israel's position on the demolition of educational facilities, please?
Okay, thanks for this webinar. Thanks, Sarah, and thanks to Foundation for Middle East Peace for hosting the seminar, and NRC for a very good and much needed report. So my focus would be indeed on measures of forcible displacement involving demolitions and planning or lack of. So when you talk about schools, the first thing we should remember that it's the Palestinian Authority's responsibility and also courts to ensure and maintain, ensure that that the Palestinian school system works and maintains as necessary. So this applies. I mean, also courts apply, of course, to Area C, and therefore fragments the territory. And that's the first reason for the ongoing vulnerability, the fact that the Palestinian Authority is responsible. East Jerusalem, I will not speak about so much because this is not my area of specialty, but definitely they don't have access to East Jerusalem, at least as formally. And so the territorial fragmentation creates kind of an absurd situation where on the one hand, there is a Palestinian Authority responsible for service provision, the school, the teachers, the curriculum, presence of students, etc. The level of the quality of education. On the other hand, they don't have the authority to actually provide for the necessary infrastructure. So this separation is one of the reasons, and I think this situation can be characterized as a permanent grain situation where schools or communities in general that are not formally recognized, in which actually schools are necessary and are constructed today, they're never completely all of them destroyed. So Israel doesn't destroy all of them. But on the other hand, they don't legalize them. So they put them in a permanent grain situation, which becomes darker and darker with more settler involvement and change of, and government, more right-wing government policy. It is important to understand that a lack of approved outline plans for the entire community subjects individuals and public infrastructure to the Israeli designed domestic law. So while Israel is obligated to the pre-occupation law, as it was as a status quo, with possibly some minor changes just to adapt to current days, like air conditioning isn't there in the Jordanian planning law. So you have some new additions, but on the other hand, it completely changed the law, and of course disregards international obligations completely. So I just want to highlight there is a myth, I think, that in Area C, civilian powers are applied by Israel as the occupying power responsible for public order lawfully. And I think this is a myth because we all know that the lawful sovereign is actually the state of Palestine and not Israel. I mean, Israel is just a temporary a holder or administrator in a territory. So a few words about the domestic legal system. So the first thing Israel did in 1971 is to dismantle Palestinian local planning committees in villages and district committees, Palestinian district committees in the entire West Bank. So Palestinians don't have the power, the lawful power, to actually activate their planning, activate the planning needs, and also recognize smaller localities, which were potentially very small in 1970, at the beginning of occupation, but has turned bigger and bigger and requires special attention and definitely formal recognition as maybe separate localities today. So since this establishment of the Israeli civil administration, we have settlements having local planning committees, while their Palestinian adjacent communities have become invisible. What the settlers actually did is to try and equate what, based on the division between settlements and outposts. So settlements were, maybe, they were lawful, they're considered lawful in Israeli domestic law, and outposts are not. So settlers have, managed to penetrate this discourse of those unrecognized Palestinian localities as being Palestinian outposts as well, which triggered a heightened enforcement against these localities. So the ICA actually sees itself as a fair broker, between the unlawful Jewish outposts and the Palestinian unlawful outposts. Of course, this is a complete absurd and in violation of international law. Besides the distortion of the pre-occupation Jordanian law, which doesn't order the demolition of unpermitted buildings because there's no planning in place for these communities, have to build schools without a permit. So even according to the domestic law, demolition is a very extreme measure of enforcement, but Israel applies it as a default enforcement mechanism. Since April 2018, for the period of 6 months from the completion of the construction and the occupancy of whatever this school is or house, a new order came into place, which grants a grace period of only 4 days before a new construction can be demolished. So before, schools could have been, established and legal proceedings and due process, the owners or could have litigated the case, and schools, could have been spared just by the prolongation of legal proceedings. Today, this is definitely not the case. And there's another order which allows for the seizure of mobile structures. It permits seizures without prior warning for the period of 90 days from the end of the construction. So these include schools or kindergartens, whatever, placed in tents, tin and wooden shacks. That's what Bedouins commonly do, also caravans. Exactly in these high-risk communities in the Jordan Valley or the South Hebron Hills. Now, monitoring has also seen settler presence with the assistance of Regavim, a settler organization, the use of drones. So this is also something new for us, beside the ICA inspectors.
We're gonna come back to the settlers. We're gonna come back to Regavim.
Okay. And also recently, I don't know if you know, the ICA has established an operations room, which receives, it's a kind of hotline, receives anonymous reports concerning illegal buildings. And the ICA says that It was not launched yet, whatever, but we found it, posted in the website of different settlements. So it's definitely, does not apply equally, and it is there for a heightened monitoring. And the last thing is that there are legal, domestic legal channels to protect schools from being destroyed, and that's kind of the leverage we use as lawyers vis-a-vis the Israeli High Court or District Court. It was first designed for a permanent schools for settlements, yeah. But since the law applies a neutral language, it can be, in theory, applied also to Palestinian schools. The problem is that it only applies if there's an outcome plan, and none of those communities have outcome plans in Area C. And also, another option is to ask for a waiver. Yeah, a waiver from a building plan, a building permit for special circumstances, but humanitarian considerations are never, a formal justification, not recognized formally as justification to ask for a waiver. So these are kind of this is the legal situation in brief.
Great, thank you so much, Netta. Thank you. So Khaled, moving to you, tell us more about the Palestinian Authority. So what is their authority or their ability to provide education to Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and also especially in Area C? Just explain to us this piece of the occupation, please.
Yeah, thanks, Samin. Obviously, both Priscilla and Netta covered a lot of ground, so I don't want to be repetitive. But let me make just a couple points. As we heard, Oslo is still the kind of operating framework for what's happening in the West Bank, including in Area C, where theoretically Israel has full security control and even civil control, but without responsibility for the population. This is part of the kind of absurdity of the Oslo framework, and it's a framework that was intended. Well, first. It was intended to last for 5 years. It was not intended, of course, to replace the legal framework of international humanitarian law, but it was envisioned as a sort of a temporary departure, if you will, from that framework. But of course, it's gone on now for almost 28 years. So as we heard, nobody of the 250,000 or 300,000 or so Palestinians who live in Area C, they live in this kind of limbo where they're in the PA's population registry, they have Palestinian IDs, they have health insurance, national health insurance through the PA, their school curriculums are organized and set by the Palestinian Authority, just as the rest of areas A and B, the populations there, but they have none of the actual responsibility or role on the ground. The PA police can't operate there, even according to Oslo. And as we heard, any Palestinian has to apply to permits through the Israeli military. That said, the Oslo framework itself is not only sort of deficient, but it's also incomplete, because the Oslo process itself was kind of frozen in time. If you remember back in 1998 and 99, there was supposed to be a third redeployment, according to Oslo, in which presumably most of Area C was to have been transferred to the control of the Palestinian Authority and would become effectively like what Area B is now. That, of course, never happened. And so the Oslo framework is not only outdated, but it's also incomplete at the same time. And so it cannot be an effective framework. And we see that also playing out in terms of the response to COVID and the distribution of the vaccine. And there's this debate about what is Israel's responsibility versus the Palestinian Authority's responsibilities in this. And I think both this, the current COVID crisis and this very timely and I think excellent report that we're talking about today highlight the need to go back to international humanitarian law as the operating framework. Oslo is simply incapable of being applied. It is, yes, it's true the Palestinian Authority exists, and new frameworks, new arrangements need to be worked out between Israel as the occupying power and the PA as a sort of local autonomy. It would be similar, I think, an analogy would be the way a municipal government or a state government in the United States would have to coordinate with the federal government. The federal government is the sovereign. And in this case, Israel, the Israeli military, Israel is the occupying power, but would have to coordinate with what is essentially a municipal power, which is the Palestinian Authority, in order to figure out the mechanisms for how Israeli obligations are implemented. And that's, I think that is what is missing from the current political discourse on this whole situation. And one thing that this report really highlights a need for is to move beyond Oslo.
I'm muted. That was great. Thank you. That was so helpful, Khaled. Thank you so much. I want to keep this focus on Area C. And Netta, I want to come back to you. So you spoke a little bit about demolitions, but tell us specifically, please, about Area C, why educational institutions are built without permits, and tell us about their situation. Do they have electricity, water, access to the internet? Please, briefly.
So educational institutions are built without a permit because communities cannot, and of course, Palestinian Authority would not ask for a permit, but communities cannot actually apply, even if they wanted to go by the Israel domestic law. I mean, the military domestic law, they cannot do that. Their schools are built on donations of private Palestinian lands, and also on Palestinian recognized state lands. So we have, it's called Khazine land. So like in Wadi Sik, for example. But the Israel demolition policy does not distinguish between the two, although clearly demolition built on private land is less justified. Nothing is justified, but this is clearly, they have no reason to interfere because there's no, as they argue, no actual rivalry with other public needs, for example, for that specific land, which is the common, argument presented by any state when something is built without a construction is built without a permit. So when we refer to education institutions, we mean both primary and secondary schools. We mean kindergartens. And in Jabal el-Baba, for example, in E1 expansion area, there's a women's center offering social and recreational as well as educational activities. So, we look at education in its broader sense. Now, the buildings, as the entire community, many times are not connected to electricity and water systems or sewage systems, but they rely on off-grid system, which is like solar panels and cisterns, whose construction, just as adding new, adding new classrooms or renovations of latrines, whatever, may trigger new threats. So the threat is ongoing. So even if the school, has managed to stay safe, when I say safe, meaning in the gray zone, not being demolished and not legalized, any new amendment may bring about new threats, and risks the original, I mean, the entire school. And this has happened, for example, in El Majaz, when they put a fence just to for the safety of the children. That has triggered, new administrative, and we had to run, after our tail to submit new plans and whatever, do whatever is necessary to protect the entire school, which became, a bigger and bigger as needs grew. So now, unpermitted schools are threatened by demolition regardless of their location. It may be either closed military areas like Masaf Rayata in South Hebron Hills or the Jordan Valley. It can also be in E1 area, which is marked for annexation, or just in deep open spaces of area C, open spaces in quotation marks, where settlers, may want to, or just that it's just not inhabited by Palestinians formally, and any school constructed there poses a new threat, and that really needs explanation. So schools mark an advancement in Palestinian development and obstruct any future implementation of any displacement goals, which may be visible or invisible. So they signal continuous community presence, which is one of the arguments of the ICA, that, the first thing they say is that this community is a new community, newly created community. I mean, has not been there, or, whatever, there's no legal basis for it actually being there. They highlight Israeli negligence in activating its civilian powers. And this is something that that the ICA doesn't like. I mean, it likes to project on its, on its big projects of development with, Japan or with the US. These, very small projects do not fall within its program of development, but they project negatively on the ICA applying its duties. They attract students and teachers from nearby communities, therefore they support the amalgamation of existing communities, and what is even worse in Israeli eyes, regional development. Because of course, that means that the entire region becomes Palestinian. This whole thing about Gavin, a publication of the new Bedouin city in South Hebron Hills, is exactly trying to do that, to scare Israelis from what are Palestinians actually doing there. They're building a new city. Another thing they do is that they challenge Israel because they clearly fall within the humanitarian needs category. And so Israel has to respond, and the High Court is really sensitive about it, about having an alternative, these students not having an alternative. So every time a school is built, is something that Israel would like to, get rid of as quick as possible, because it raises up this question of what is Israel actually doing, and of course, it's more susceptible to international pressure, diplomatic pressure, which is also something that Israel would like to avoid. So de facto, schools, and I have to say also clinics, are at many times granted indirect judicial protection. And I say indirect judicial protection, I mean by either the court prolonging, legal proceedings, or pressuring the parties to reach a compromise, or to even shift the legal track from the quick 4-day demolition track to the regular, long-term proceedings. So I think the ICA sees that, and so it happened in several cases in Area C, and I think that's also one of the reasons for immediate demolition. They're also considered political tools. That's, I think, the worst of it all. Proceeding in what they see as a lawfare, fighting Israeli presence in the occupied territory through the use of the law. So it can either be domestically, I mean, when this comes to the High Court, if there's a lawyer, there's a potential of the school to just remain in place. And now, of course, internationally, because it triggers the international intervention in what Israel is considering a private issue. I mean, it does consider the West Bank to be, and of course, the education of Palestinians as its own private issue, meaning even though it doesn't initiate any construction of new schools, schools without a permit cannot be construction. So this is kind of clear de-development policy that they facilitate.
Thank you, Netta. Priscilla, staying with Area C, tell us about the special circumstances that the Bedouin and the herding communities face in Area C, and why it's so important to focus on them as you did in your research.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And it's, one that certainly came up a lot as we were starting our research. So the thing is that there are 30,000 Palestinians that are living in these 183 Bedouin herding communities. So, they're really living kind of on the fringe of society, both sort of economically, in terms of, access and services. And many of them are actually landless refugees, and they have been displaced internally once or more. What's happened is that, with Israel's historic and current occupation policies affecting Area C, they've been subjected to these two contradictory but sort of simultaneous forces. So on the one hand, they've been forced to undergo this rapid urbanization. So being forced to no longer have this semi-nomadic herding lifestyle, which worked economically, because then you could shift around with changing seasons that would give you access to food, to water for your animals. Without that, you have a different situation. Now you have to purchase water for your animals. Now you have to purchase fodder. So on the one hand, rapid urbanization, but then on the other hand, after rapid urbanization, enforced non-development. And, I just want to make sure we make clear that we're not advocating that they be moved into cities. We are advocating that that development be, of their choosing in the way that they choose, because these are people who are carrying on a traditional lifestyle. So, as they lose that access to the seasonal grazing lands, what they would want is to be able to install water infrastructure so that they could have that cheaper municipal water rather than having to go and buy these tankers, which are much more expensive. And so with these two sort of forces acting simultaneously, they've been pushed, up against the wall. They have a very, very, very fine margin of existence, economically, very, very slim way of surviving here. And that means it's an all hands on deck situation where any small shock can really sort of throw a family off course, and education can be one of those things that gets lost in the mix. What we see in these communities is advocacy efforts and, fundraising efforts and so on to put up a school, and then that school can be gone, just so that quickly. We see that humanitarian organizations are struggling to live out their mandates to deliver humanitarian aid, sometimes resorting to things like having to install water infrastructure or things like that under the cover of night, for fear that, as soon as it's detected, something's going to kick in and the pressure is going to begin mounting and the stop work orders are going to be delivered and so forth. We see that older boys are at risk of being pulled out of school, especially as these communities are finding it harder and harder to eke out a livelihood from herding. We find that they're having to sell off their herds and lose some of that, long passed down tradition, which is really heartbreaking. And that, at the same time that, nothing is really safe. You're in a constant state of anxiety because the tent you sleep in could be dismantled or confiscated. There were children saying that they were afraid to go to school and that they might come back and find that their home is gone. And so these are really, unsustainable conditions for human life. And yet people are continuing through just sort of will and resilience to make their lives there. Just to give you a sense, Netta was talking about, of course, all the schools that are under demolition risk. There are 52 Palestinian schools as of the end of October that are under demolition risk, and 44 of those schools are actually, in Area C. So it's interesting because many people have this perception, since the attendance rates, sort of the national Palestinian attendance rates, are so strong, of like, well, why are we talking about education? Palestinians are succeeding. And yet, on this other side of the picture, we can see that there are communities that, a third of these Bedouin communities don't even have any kind of school at all. And that the ones that do have a school, as Netta was talking about, they are in disrepair, they are crumbling, they are tents, with outdoor latrines. These are not the images that come to mind when we think about schools. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a picture of why we felt it was so important to look at these communities on the fringe.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Khaled, I'm returning to you, and I actually have a two-part question for you. I'll ask you both. So we want to talk about the focus on settlers in Area C and settlers and their work with the state. But the first part of the question is that settlers and the Israeli government have been quite focused on EU-funded schools, among other projects. So I want to ask you to talk to us about this focus on EU-funded schools. And in the report, for instance, there are photos of latrines that were donated by the EU, right, and also slated for demolition. So tell us about the EU-funded schools and how that fits in with the Israeli government's drive to annex this area. And then my next question, which I'll come back to, is really about settler violence and distinguishing between the state and the actions of private settlers, just so you know. So both those questions are for you.
Yeah, in terms of the EU-funded schools, I mean, I'm not sure that it matters that they're EU-funded per se. It's that, I suppose the fact that they are EU-funded kind of plays into ideologically the mindset that exists among many on the Israeli right, who of course dominate the settler movement, and that is that Europe is historically an anti-Semitic continent, and this is another manifestation of that anti-Semitism, is trying to these attacks on Israeli claims in Judea and Samaria. So it might have an ideological element to it, but I think it's mainly the fact that there is any Palestinian construction or projects going on in these areas, especially. I mean, Area C comprises 60% of the West Bank, more than 60% of the West Bank, and more than half of that is already under settler jurisdiction. And so there is a real fear of establishing precedents, of having Palestinian construction that is backed by the international community become permanent. And that would, so there's a practical element, and then there's an ideological component. I think the ideological component, I think, matters quite a bit. Both Israel and the settlers have a desire to control the land, but at the same time, all of it, and at the same time have a desire not to have responsibility for the people who live on that land, i.e. the Palestinians. Any of them. So the goal is to maximize Israeli control of land and minimize Israeli responsibility for people. Oslo provides kind of the perfect arrangement in that it really makes a strong separation between control over land and control over, or I should say, responsibility over people, because Israel still controls the population in Area C, but it doesn't have responsibility for them in its own view. I mean, as I said, there's this drive that is both practical and ideologically driven. In terms of the settler violence, could you rephrase or reframe your question? I don't remember specifically what it was.
Yes, that was unfair of me to give you two at once. We see routinely spikes of settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank, especially right now. We're in the midst of such a spike. And I want to ask you to help us distinguish between the state and the state's legal actions against Palestinians in Area C and the actions of the private settlers or the settlers. And what are the settlers doing to add to the legal assault of the state on Palestinian education?
Yeah, I mean, I think the lines are very blurry, to be honest, between settlers and the army. There are, in fact, many settlers who serve in the army, but also, again, kind of coming back to the ideological and the political component of this. There's a symbiotic relationship between the settlers and the Israeli army. The settlements could not exist without the Israeli army, which provides everything from the land, right, through expropriation, through various kind of legal, quasi-legal means, all the way through construction and infrastructure. And so you need to have the army there for the settlement project to exist, to thrive. And at the same time, the primary reason the army is there is to facilitate and expand the settler project. So they are, I think, organically connected. In terms of what the settlers do, the settlers have a special place in that, it's a bit of the law of the jungle. They are theoretically under Israeli law, civilian law in terms of, let's say, criminal law. But what we see is something that looks much more like the Wild West. And so even within the narrow and deeply flawed confines of Israeli domestic law, there is really an absence of rule of law. I mean, it really is a classic case of rule by law, where the army is essentially the parliament. They can promulgate whatever new laws are necessary, ostensibly for security purpose, but what ends up in reality being to serve the settler project. When the army occasionally, as we've seen in the last couple of weeks, occasionally will enforce the law against members of the settler community, particularly when they target Israeli law enforcement or security or military, we see this backlash with the settlers. So the settlers have a way of acting beyond the law, and they're oftentimes permitted to do that by the Israeli army, which is supposedly the law enforcement in the occupied territories. And so we end up seeing what is essentially mob rule, where the settler movement is the mob that is dictating to the army if and when and how it should enforce whether construction permit violations or infrastructure or even basic law enforcement. So this backlash that we're seeing now in response to the killing of an Israeli settler who was being pursued by Israeli police, the backlash is directed primarily at Palestinians because there's an understanding that they are the weak link. This is a population that the IDF is supposedly also has to protect as civilians and as the occupying power, but of course, it doesn't really have an interest for ideological and political reasons in doing that. And so it really does kind of expose this, both the symbiotic relationship between the settler movement and the military and its weaknesses vis-a-vis the protection of Palestinians.
Thank you, Khaled. Priscilla, I want to ask you specifically to give us some specific examples of attacks by settlers that you document in the report. I think it would be helpful for us to know what that looks like in real life.
Certainly. So 1/4 of the attacks on education that we found in the data set were actually perpetrated by usually Israeli settlers, and then in a few cases, these private settlement security guards, which are also settlers, but have a slightly different sort of positionality. And among the attacks by this group, the most prevalent type was harassment and intimidation of students. Examples of that could include, like a wide number of things, but some stories that come to my mind are ones where some boys were walking to school in the morning and an armed private security guard started to chase them and pursue them for a period. Eventually, again, he's armed, so he's behaving like forces in this situation, detaining them, interrogating them, accusing them of throwing stones at the settlement, and delaying them reaching school. And in many cases, as Khaled was pointing out, like it's overlapping, it's sort of blurry and unclear because maybe the Israeli forces then come in and add something additional. So we also have many situations where Israeli settlers are following students as they're going to school on foot or in a car, blocking their path, saying you can't enter here, you can't go on this road, things like that, verbally assaulting them, shouting out threats, and also, group behaviors, not only the actions of sort of rogue individuals, but organized groups coming together, gathering outside of a school, firing weapons near the school, and all of this we would count as the more minor harassment and intimidation attacks. The second most prevalent type of attack we saw from this group was attacks against school infrastructure. Vandalization, and that could be more minor, such as hate speech on a wall. I know minor is a bit, it sounds cold, and yet we had much more severe incidents too. It could be things like smashing the security cameras, arson, stonings, and one of the really severe incidents to do with stonings that stuck with me was from October 2018 in Uruf School, which is south of Nablus City. It's near Yitzhar settlement, which is sort of like on this mountain overlooking 6 Palestinian villages. And a group of settlers gathered, descended towards the school, armed with axes, armed with stones. They entered the school property. They stoned the classroom windows while kids were inside. And then the Israeli forces were actually accompanying them the whole time. And, what did they do? Well, they shot out tear gas canisters, they shot rubber bullets, and then the Israeli forces ended up injuring 7 students with those rubber bullets and a teacher. It's certainly something that's a kind of prominent feature, and some schools more than others. And when we talk about Area C, it's less likely these kinds of attacks, and it's more the kinds of things that Netta was talking about, of being monitored, of sort of serving as a assistance around school infrastructure removal.
Thank you so much. We have a question in the Q&A specifically about teachers. Will you tell us, you mentioned a teacher now, will you just give us a brief overview of the situation for teachers?
Yeah, for teachers, it can be quite challenging because these are professionals trying to carry out their duties, and yet they don't have that much control over, for example, how they're going to get to school if they have to cross a checkpoint. And they're more likely to be held at the checkpoint than the students are because they're adults. And so, that's a constant challenge of teachers saying, do I really want to keep working in this school because this school is having, high volume of problems and I'm not even able to get there. I read one really heartbreaking interview by a teacher who was struggling with that, who was saying that I feel compelled to continue to serve these children, and yet he was describing an experience where a child was being pursued by soldiers, came running into the principal's office, and where he wasn't able to prevent the child from being arrested, and that this young child was, crying, begging him to protect him, and he wasn't able to, and the child was arrested, and the family blamed the teachers for not preventing it. And the teachers was really struggling with, what's my responsibility here? should I just take an easier job in a different part of the West Bank? Because certainly some schools are struck by these problems much more often than others. And I think, at the same time, they're trying to, all of this is just the protection issue, because after all of that happens, then you have to go into the classroom and you have to actually teach. You have to actually, do the rest of the job. I was a teacher many years ago, and just without all of those things, it's a very sacred responsibility and a very difficult job. So my heart really goes out to these teachers continuing to work at this in such circumstances.
Thank you. Thank you, Netta. Thank you, Priscilla.
Yeah, sure.
Netta, I want to ask you, you spoke about the importance you spoke about how the Israeli state views the development of the schools as really being a sign that these communities are here to stay and to expand. But tell us what the flip side looks like. What do you think are the outcomes, the impact of these attacks on education, in the greater effort to displace these populations? What is the role of the attack on education?
Okay, so educational institutions do not only provide education for children during school hours, they're generally utilized as community centers, serving the entire community in festivities, public events. They also open the door for girl students and disabled children, as their location is the most important thing. I mean, it's in the community. So it reduces the fear of harassment from the fear of their parents from harassment and adaptability to their cultural needs or needs for accessibility. I mean, the impact is really broad. These localities are formally unrecognized, so measures of safety are commonly lacking. Residents cannot, construct fences or any other, take any safety measures that incorporate construction. So schools are usually the safest public spaces for children for extracurricular activities. Schools also promote community adhesion and encourage shared responsibility. So for example, in Majaz school, so the legal protection measures that were required for the schools is actually, resulted in the establishment of a parents committee. I think it's one of the rare parents committee in area C, like a formal one. It also facilitates inter-community engagement on a cluster level, and the school gathers students from different places, so it reinforces steadfastness and resilience. And I think it's also, I know that it also facilitates, it's a trigger for community-based planning for the entire locality. So once the school is there, and that's why the ICA is so much upset, the impact is really strong, because they start looking at at their village as a village, and they actually start planning the entire community. I think this is the scariest move of to the ICA, that it would actually become a sustainable community. Which has clear spatial organization, and then they would need a road, and then they would need infrastructure like water systems and networks and electricity, and also of course the international support. I think Khaled was mentioning European intervention. I think European intervention in particular is targeted by the Israeli Knesset, the Israeli Parliament. They established a special committee just to engage with European interventions, because they actually put villages on the map, because they highlight the collective needs of the entire community of tens of students. It becomes apparent, and it is therefore something that Israel has to engage with.
Thank you, Netta. Khaled, speak to us for a moment. We are moving into the section of the webinar when we're going to talk about policy recommendations, and what's possible. And I want to ask you first, what do you think is possible in terms of implementing protections for these communities, for the Palestinian and Bedouin communities and the schools, particularly in Area C?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's obviously it depends on who we're talking about. Obviously, Israel can do a lot. Israel, it is, I think Israel's primary responsibility for the creation of this problem. And therefore, I think it is appropriate that we look to Israel to pursue changes. Obviously, there is no political will on Israel's part to do that, as we heard, as we discussed before, both for political and ideological reasons. And so it really, I think, comes down to a responsibility of the international community. Even in terms of the Palestinian Authority, again, I think Palestinian leadership has very, very limited responsibility here, because there's not much it can do on the ground, but it can do things, I think, in the international legal and diplomatic arena, if it has the political will. And I think depending on how things unfold under an under a Biden administration, it's, that is an open question whether the Palestinian leadership has the political will to basically annoy folks in Washington by pursuing things like the International Criminal Court, or pushing for international protection or some sort of international intervention that is outside of what we consider, the peace process. Peace process, I use that term very, very loosely. So there's not a lot that the Palestinian leadership can do, certainly on the ground, but it can pursue, a legal track if it is willing to do that. In terms of, I'll just sort of skip ahead and talk about a Biden administration, what I think it can or cannot do, or should or shouldn't do. I think a Biden administration will be eager to want to undo a lot of the Trump administration's legacy on a whole range of issues, this being one of them, but certainly not limited to this issue. And if anything, this issue will be very low on the list of priorities, both in the overall to-do list for the administration, but even in terms of foreign policy priorities, it's not going to be a top-tier issue. I think that said, the administration will want to reaffirm the basic international parameters, the framework of international law and legitimacy, especially the UN Resolution 242, which is the pillar of the Arab-Israeli and Palestinian-Israeli peace process, but is also rooted in this notion that it is inadmissible to annex territory through force, whether we're talking about de jure annexation or the day-to-day de facto annexation that is happening as we speak through the expansion of and maintenance of the settlement project. So those are things I think the administration has to be as clear in reaffirming those principles of international law, including the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law. And it needs to be as clear in reaffirming them as the Trump administration was in trying to negate and repudiate them. Whether it will or how much it will, I think is a bit of an open question. I think the other thing a Biden administration will need to do, not something I think it will necessarily pursue, at least not early on, is to work with its international partners, both in the region and others like Europe and the United Nations, in promoting some form of mechanisms of accountability. This is something that the Oslo process has lacked for the past 28 years. If you're going to have a successful peace process of any kind, you have to have some mechanisms of accountability. Otherwise, you end up with a situation of might makes right, and the stronger party simply dictates realities irrespective of whatever may have been agreed upon. And that, of course, is why we're in the situation that we're in.
Great, thank you. That's so helpful. So I want us, we have just a few more minutes. So Netta and Priscilla, I'm going to ask you to keep your answers brief, please. But we want to talk about the policy recommendations. So Netta, I want to start with you. Like, what measures of protection do you recommend against demolition or seizure of educational institutions? What needs to be done here?
Okay. Very brief. I know that there's, a gap in adherence of international law in light of Israel's actions and policies, but I do still recommend getting domestic legal advice. I think at least as long as we can utilize it, it should be utilized, and we should not abandon this channel. This is one thing. And the second thing, I think we need to think of humanitarian reports. Sometimes with regard to any specific school we're talking about. I think the humanitarian reports that are even submitted to the ICA and of course to the court are very, very helpful because they reveal information and present data which is just not available and inexistent in any Israeli discourse. So presenting them with the facts, I think, is very, very useful, at least for temporary protection. And then, of course, preparing advocacy kits. And I do think that, upscaling the advocacy messaging can be also considered. There are Israeli scholars which have, already analyzed the Israeli planning regime as being unlawful and its application. For example, Professor Eyal Ben-Venisti, who is written the case for Israel in ICC now, has an expert opinion supporting Susia. And even noting that its demolition would be a grave breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention. I think this is really strong to use that. And I also would encourage, beyond just violation of international humanitarian law and human rights law, to do consider the prohibition of colonization. I know it's very hard, and de facto annexation has been, the furthest, this is something that is still, annexation is something we're struggling with in terms of the messaging, but I think we should also consider the prohibition of colonization. Diplomatic support is just inevitable without diplomatic pressure. Before, during demolitions, and after, hand in hand with the legal protection, humanitarian protection, these three measures are just essential. And I also think that highlighting the uniqueness of each school, sometimes we think of, the vulnerable populations that are being served by this school are much more than just students. It's girl students and it's children with disabilities. And I think this is also something that we can utilize.
Great, thank you. Thank you for all of that. And Priscilla, we're gonna give you the last word, which is, you wrote this terrific report and you've done all of this research. So what is Norwegian Refugee Council doing to advance change and accountability? And also, for our audience, what can organizations and individuals do to support these efforts?
Yeah, certainly writing this report is a part of that effort, right? We cannot advance change and accountability without real data, without evidence, and without highlighting these issues before policymakers. So that's exactly, why we wrote this report. I think, to kind of circle back to some of what Khaled and Netta are saying too, it's really going to come down to the international community and to third states. You can certainly read the full list of recommendations we have to each different party. But since we are going to keep it short here, I'll say that, third states do have this responsibility to hold Israel responsible for acts that are violating international law and humanitarian law. And many times states perceive that to be like a political ask to uphold this responsibility. when in fact it's an obligation. It's neutral. It's failing, to uphold that responsibility. That is actually the political decision. So we would ask third states to really think about leveraging their humanitarian diplomacy as a form of pressuring Israel. And, the two, I think, front of mind points are to say that Israel must halt the destruction, just as a baseline, it must halt the destruction of school infrastructure, the seizure of school property, of tents, latrines, all for educational purposes. And, it must allow humanitarian access to flow unimpeded into Area C. And public advocacy can certainly be effective, as Netta was talking about. I would just add one word of caution on that note, which is to say, the international community has sometimes in the past taken this approach that's overly focused on like red lines, like, I think Susia was a great example of that, where the international community kind of indicates like, you cannot cross this line. If you do, there's going to be a fallout. And we saw that approach being very effective against Khan al-Ahmar, against Susia. But then it was almost like an unintended communication. What's left out of that speech is, well, what about everywhere else? And so while Israel set Khan al-Ahmar aside, it went and destroyed the entire community of Khirbat Hamza. And so, as Khaled was saying about annexation, if we make that red line be de jure formal annexation, then are we, communicating that Israel can just continue forward with de facto annexation, which is equally egregious under international law. So we have to be really careful to hold this line around international law and international humanitarian law led policy, which has not been US's approach towards the whole, Israel-Palestine conflict. It hasn't had that as the main guiding principle. And we need to really push in that direction.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I want to thank all three of you on behalf of FMEP and NRC. Thank you so much, Netta, Khaled, and Priscilla, for participating in today's webinar. This was a great discussion. It was rich and very timely.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to thank the audience also, and thank everyone who sent in questions. We worked in several of them and answered several of them, and the ones that we didn't, I apologize. All of the questions that we will give to the panelists so that they can know what you're interested in hearing more about, and can use those questions to help guide their work. So thank you all for joining us today, and check back with the FMEP website, fmep.org, for a recording of this webinar and to sign up for our upcoming webinars. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.